Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Brightworks. Today, joined again by BARCastTV, and we're super excited to bring you the next episode in What to Do in the Mid-Game. Top 10 tips. Hey there, BARCast.
Hey, Brightworks. Thanks for having me on again. Glad to be on the channel doing another collaboration and finishing up the series. We're adding
Yeah, super excited to have you.
Yeah.
It's going to be great. So what do you have for us today?
Well, like you said earlier, this is top 10 mid-game tips for new players. And first of all, I think we should define what is the mid-game.
Absolutely, yeah. So this varies, I feel, and I know you feel the same way, from the 8 versus 8 style to the 1 versus 1 style, and everywhere in between, free-for-all, 2v2s, all that sort of stuff. It can vary from player to player, but I think I solidly define the mid-game as starting when you are looking to build that T2 factory. So when you're looking for the metal to fund your T2 transition, I think that's the start of the mid-game. And I think it ends basically as soon as you finish up your very first advanced fusion reactor. I think by that point, your economy has gotten to a point that you're ready to transition into the late game.
Yeah, and as you kind of alluded to, this definition changes depending on the context of, is it a 1v1? And kind of, I suppose my expertise would be in case of 1v1 split map, when we enter the mid game is when we've achieved kind of split map, so all the mexes are taken. In the case of 8v8s, the front lines are established. There's kind of like a slowing down of movement between the opposing teams. So I'd say that's kind of my definition of like when the mid game starts.
That's definitely a great definition. Yeah. I think I agree. I don't have much more to say about that. I think that basically covers our bases, and everyone's going to have a nice frame of reference for what we're talking about here.
Okay, so we'll move on to the first topic then. So it'd be like T2 transitions, right? So like what are players looking for? What economy markers are you trying to hit before we kind of move into the mid game and start transitioning to T2? So
yeah, so I think that the important markers to look for on a macroscopic scale, one of them is that you have your metal extractors taken. That should be a given, right? We're well into the game, and at this point, you should, like you said, have that split map control. Basically, everything should be taken up. I think the other thing is you want to make sure that there's sufficient metal either out on the field or available from your own production in order to keep things keep production up while you're teching up, or have some sort of a big enough army that you can maintain that presence on the field while you're vulnerable.
Those are good indicators, of course. If I could add any other caveats to that, I would say it's like when to know to transition to T2. Obviously, is if your opponent has moved into T2 and you get that alert from your UI. It's like, oh, T2 unit spotted, so that should really instantly trigger you to kind of stop T1 production. If you can, if you need to, reclaim your factory and start constructing on the T2 land or bot lab.
Yeah. If you see T2 on the field, for one, you know that your enemy's going to be spending a whole lot more metal on units, which is it's going to make res bots all the more important, and I think we get to that later on. But I think that's a great idea, having those T2 units out on the field. It definitely needs to shake up your mindset, and you need to get into that idea. Okay, it's time to step up the game here. It's time to get into that T2 frame of reference. Otherwise, you're just going to be out competed. We all know just how devastating those fiends can be against your T1 units. Absolutely crushing.
Sheltons, all the units.
All those nasty ones.
So I suppose that'd be a good time to kind of transition or segue into our next topic, which actually is the resbot, which we covered previously in the early game video. But it's like, what differences, or how do you use the resbot differently in the mid game stage, and what players should be looking to do?
Yeah, those res bots, man, they're so important. They really, it's hard to even place those. I know we've had difficulties placing those res bots as far as early game, late game, mid game, just because you really need them everywhere. But they do serve some really important roles in the mid game. The one that comes to mind for me, of course, is reclaiming all that metal off of the front lines. you can fold that metal back into your own army, and it really benefits you greatly when that delicious metal scrap starts rolling back in, and you can fund your army, make it even bigger, continue your war machine. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's just maybe the unit becomes even more important the longer the game goes on. Of course, in 8v8s, you start seeing these huge reclaim fields starting to form, or like say a line collapses and units start pouring through. Well, everything behind that has been captured or rolled over in your push is like should be kind of like like even more important than low-hanging fruit. It's like, oh, that's where I need to focus my attention with my res bots, and I kind of deny the enemy team from taking back this area, say if they stop the push, and really get that mass as quickly as you can, really. So that's...
Yeah, absolutely. Have you seen the widget for selecting or for highlighting the metal nodes here? I'll see if I can activate this, and it'll probably show you. Should ping on here in just a second. Here you can see these little boxes. Have you seen this widget yet?
No.
I installed this widget recently, and it has absolutely revolutionized the way that I play this game. Suddenly, these little boxes appear all over the map, and you can see just how important that reclaim is, because you start seeing these multiple thousands of resources laying around on the field, and you realize, oh crap, that's where the metal comes from for a T2 transition. It's right there.
Does that give a larger box for like over an entire reclaim field? Does it tell you like, oh, there's 3K mass right here?
Yeah, so you can see in this big box over here, you can see it sort of dynamically changes to fit all the reclaim into it.
That's so cool. Okay.
Super useful.
At least for spectators, at least. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it definitely gives you the opportunity. Well, it also works in game too. This is a game widget, so you can use this one in game, and it's very useful because say for example, rather, you're the red player here, and you're looking at this and you're like, okay, there's a couple of wrecks here, it's not that valuable, but then, or maybe you're looking at it like this, okay, there's a few wrecks, it's not that valuable, but then you turn this mode on and you can see, oh, this is actually almost 1,000 metal. That could be about a third of the way towards a full tech transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just gets your mind into that mindset.
Oh, that's a cool widget. I'm gonna have to take a look at that and see if I can incorporate that into my own games. That's so
I'd
cool.
recommend it for sure.
So on the topic of res bots, coming into the mid game, we also have access to additional units that kind of function in the same role, perhaps, and that would be the Weber and the T2 combat engineer. So, how should players be utilizing these units like as they move into the mid game, and perhaps like what differences do they have, with their res bot counterpart?
Well, the Weber, man, I have nothing but praise for the Weber, and I'll give you my whole spiel about how to use that thing, because I love to use that in those big team games. But I think we should talk about the T2 engineers, the combat engineers first, because they're a tricky one to master. The Armada, their combat engineer comes out of their vehicle lab. Again, aggressive pinging here. Their combat engineer comes out of the vehicle lab, which is interesting. It's called the console, and let me see if I can find an example out on the field here. Here we are. So here you can see the console is their combat engineer, and mirrored for that is the Cortex combat engineer, which is the Twitcher, which comes out of the T2 Cortex bot lab. I can't find one at the moment, but it is the Twitcher, and you've probably seen them around because they're very, very prominent. But both of these units are capable of building some sort of skirmisher unit on the front lines, which is so powerful. I mean, you can give these away to your teammates, and then suddenly you've essentially given them a T2 transition without them actually having to go through the steps of teching up, right? It's sort of... Yeah, go ahead.
Do you feel like you should emphasize giving your teammates one of these combat engineers over a 2-2 construction vehicle, or what do you think would be more important to give to your teammate?
I've recently had a change of mind about that. I've been thinking about that a lot, actually, especially in preparation for this video, but in general in my own play. I think it's probably the ideal scenario is you give them both, because you're going to... The T2 Constructor is what boosts their economy. The Engineer is what boosts their military power, their army power on the front lines. So I think both is ideal, but I think I would definitely recommend building a combat engineer first for them, because at the end of the day, if they can get that early T2 unit out on the field, their army is going to be that much more efficient on the front lines, and they're going to be able to hold a lot longer, and they might not even need your help to get up to the T2 stage after that, because they're going to have so much more metal because their army is more efficient.
Yeah. I suppose, say if you did give someone the T2 combat engineer and they were able to get, say, like a few Sheltons out, what have you, or some T2 units, that's going to let them hold on to the front line and facilitate a T2 transition for themselves. So
yeah, that's my thoughts exactly, and I'm glad we're on the same page here. So that's my takeaway, is definitely hand out those T2 combat engineers and get them out on the field. But let's talk about the Weber, shall we? I absolutely love this unit. Do you have any notes about it before I launch into a tirade?
To my shame, I'll have to say I've never had a chance to use this unit. So go ahead.
Oh
and give
boy.
us your...
Well, let me explain to you exactly how wonderful the world of Webers is. The worldwide Weber, if you will. Looking for a T2 lab here to see if I can highlight one. They come out of the T2 Armada bot lab, which, wow, we're all Cortex on this side here, except for one Armada player, but they're playing vehicles. Okay, well, you'll just have to take my word for it. The Weber is a all-terrain EMP reclaim spider. A lot of hats all at once, but we'll break them down here. It's a EMP spider, so it fires a little EMP blast that can temporarily disrupt stuff. Very similar to a shuriken, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Those come out in great number for any T1 Cortex air player. The shuriken, it's like the shuriken, but it walks on 6 legs, and it also can crawl up hills. That's the all-terrain part. Both of those are pretty self-explanatory, but the interesting part is its method of attack. So the EMP isn't really its main attack. Its main superpower is that it can reclaim things. So the speciality of these things is that they can EMP a unit, and then they eat it alive, essentially. Very, very alike a real spider in real life. They devour their corpses alive. But they're an excellent option for if you're looking to reclaim into that late T2, because what you can do is spam them out in a big pattern. And so I'll highlight this using a bunch of selected units here, but if you imagine you had a bunch of Webers, what I like to do is move them across the map like this in just a nice big pattern. So I just set a move command, assuming that I'm on the red team here, so that they're all spread out. And then I hit F to issue a fight command, and I shift right click on the other side of the map so that all of them start walking in a straight line, and you'll see these lines basically marked across the map where these Webers are going to walk, and everything in that path is going to get eaten up by these Webers, and it just lets you reclaim everything on the field without, well, basically without any of it going back to the enemy, and I think that's super, super powerful.
I suppose it can kind of maybe protect itself a little bit better than the T1 Rosebot as well, having the EMP gun attached to it.
Yeah, it definitely shuts down those, like if grunts are pushing into it, grunts or pawns or something like that. It also shuts down anything like the, we're going to get to witness the comm trade mechanics here. Still the same comm trade. But anyway, yeah, it really shuts down. They're also a lot tankier. So they can take a lot more hits as well, which helps them survive a lot better on the front lines. But yeah, that's all my notes on the Weber. I mean, I could fanatically go into more detail about it, but I think that'll do for our purposes here.
Yeah, I think that's sufficient enough, so we can transition into our next topic, which we covered in our previous video, but that would just be, communication with your teammates and how that changes as we enter the mid-game.
Yeah, so communication, I mean, I think you'd agree that it's just as important in the mid-game as it is in the late game, but the things that you talk about are a little bit different, and I think that tends to be things like how the actual battle is unfolding, whether you need specific support, maybe air support or some sort of artillery support, communicating about whether or not you've gotten a Tech 2 Constructor. I feel like a lot of times I've seen players that are expecting a T2 Constructor to upgrade their economies, but it just never came. And it's not because of any sort of malicious intent, it's just that the backline techer had to give out a few of them, and they might have forgotten you. And I think things like that are really important to communicate.
It's interesting. I have to say I'm a little less inexperienced in these big 8v8 team games, but that's definitely something you want to be kind of acknowledging to your teammates, like, hey, I've moved on to T2. Like, does anybody need a T2 construction vehicle or the combat engineer? So you definitely want to put yourself out there and give players the opportunity to respond to you and let you know what they need if you find yourself in the teching position.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely makes you you kind of have to come out of your shell a little bit because I mean, if you're playing the team game mode, it's a huge advantage to have that T2 lab up and manage to get those T2 units out to your team. So I definitely encourage you to communicate about that. There's also some other stuff that you have to communicate. I mean, I know this isn't as important on 1v1s, but I guess in 8v8s it becomes important to communicate any sort of joint strategies. Do you have any notes about joint strategies you want to share?
Yeah, this is something I suppose you might not specifically talk about while you're in the middle of the mid game, but say if you and your team decide, hey, at this timing marker, we're gonna all push in this one exact lane. So it's just something you want to, state, communicate in the early part of the game, and then also reiterate as you move into the mid game. Hey, it's time for this timing attack. Let's all get together at this point. Press this player.
Yep. Yeah. You if you can coordinate those attacks, you can suddenly hit with a tremendous force right in the middle of the map, or well, anywhere on the map, and that can oftentimes break the front lines here, which can be really, really important. We talked about in the preparation session that strategy that I was thinking about, where you every once in a while you just dedicate one or two of your units out of your production cycle to go somewhere on the map. Like for instance here, maybe everyone just sends a unit down south every once in a while, and then by the 20-minute mark or something, there's this huge standing army for the purple player here, and they can use it to completely crush through their lane. I wonder if that would work, but that's definitely one example of how communication could really help you.
Yeah, BAR is a new game. It's still developing, and I want to say there's a lot of room for improvement of players or new strategies to develop, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely we're definitely all learning this game together, and even the old heads who came from, Planetary Annihilation or Balanced Annihilation, all those predecessor games, there's still nuances to learn here, which I think is wonderful because it does give us something to continually talk about here. Yeah, I think that's about all my notes on communication. Just keep it up and keep it frequent and keep it relevant too. Don't complain like Skag has done here. Keep it respectful. You're gonna have a better time.
Yeah, so let's move into our next topic, which would be a little bit perhaps more technical, and we're just observing one, but it'd be like, don't make fire bases and make units instead. It's like, well, what do I mean by fire bases would be exactly what we see here on the screen, and a couple of the blue player has one. It's like you have these lines of LLTs with anti-air behind them, perhaps some heavier turrets, some artillery. It's like you have this super high concentration of metal in the map that's defending one specific location, whereas a player who's just making units can totally avoid these structures or these fire bases, move around them, and attack your backline. So
yep, I don't have much more to say specifically about this other than that I completely agree. Units will always beat static defense in this game because there's always an option. This game is built around the idea that static defense can always be maneuvered around or sieged one way or another. There's always an option to siege them, countered. Yeah, and I think it's important to keep that in mind here. I mean, look at these Sheldon. They're essentially effortlessly tearing this down. I mean, they're getting blown up by this Arbiter here. But aside from that, it's just unlimited damage, and so this lightning turret here has gotten 0% value, negative infinity value, which is about as bad as it gets.
Yeah, and so maybe as who can relate this to newer players, it's like you might be tempted to kind of get into a shell of these static defenses, but really the mass is better spent in these units that are running around. You can see
right here. Yep, there it is. You can see all that mass went right into these fiends, and they've completely broken this front line here.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a great example. Thanks so much to Skag for highlighting that for us. Very nicely done.
I guess that gives us a time to move into our next topic, which would be opportunity paths. And this is something you brought up in our notes session. What do you mean by opportunity paths, and how can new players incorporate this into their style?
Yeah, this is an idea that I'm still working on because it's new to me as well. But I think the premise of it is solid, and the idea is that when you're looking to produce units, this might be a good example here. You can see that we're sending fiends through. And what we're looking for is the least abrasive path here. So we're looking for areas where there's no defenses. We're looking for exposed economy centers. And for what it's worth, Skeg has done a phenomenal job of finding the economy back here. We've managed to essentially avoid all of the units and push into the backline. So that is basically as good an example of an opportunity path as I could imagine here, where you can see that any time there's an exposed defensive line or undefended line where you can get into the back of another player's economy, that's what I would call an opportunity path. But it's not just that. I think it's also, broadly speaking, any sort of way that you can get around a bad trade, and you can fight a battle that is much more in your favor, whether that's a better concave on your units or for your units against the enemy's units, or maybe it's it's just making sure that you have the right composition in order to fight a army.
Yeah. I think if I could relate this to 1v1s and kind of picking up on your point about trading armies, it's like if you're familiar enough with unit compositions and what counters what, well, this gives you the opportunity to, my opponent is making X unit, it's countered by this such unit, so you kind of have the strategy kind of comes to you instead of sitting there wondering, like, what do I do in this position? It's like, well, you need to be able to respond to what your opponent's doing, and you can make effective trades. You can be cost efficient with your units, and that's going to, lead to you winning games.
Yeah, I noticed in 1v1s, I mean, those get aggressive so fast, and they tend to stick around in the lower tiers of units a lot longer than the team games do. Mm-hmm. The team games, it's kind of like a race to get as high of tech out as you can. Whereas 1v1s, it's more of like, how can we be as aggressive as possible? At least that's my observation. You're the 1v1 expert here.
I don't know if I'm necessarily an expert, but I definitely play more 1v1s than team games.
Yeah, you've got me beat at the very least. But yeah, I think that's a really good example of how you can always be moving units around. Keep your light units, your scouts, and your pawns, grunts, blitzes, whatever it happens to be. And just keep them moving around in such a way that you're constantly going to have them either scouting for weak points in the enemy's defenses, or best case scenario, actually finding a exploitable path. Mm-hmm. I think it just goes hand in hand for 8v8s and those 1v1s. It's just you have to deal with multiple colors in 8v8s, but the premise is almost exactly the same.
Yeah, and maybe this is a little higher level of a topic for newer players, but if you kind of have in the back of your mind, it's like, where can I find value? This is going to, it's a skill you're just going to get better and better at as a player. So definitely something to kind of have in the back of your mind. And it's a great topic, really, and opportunity paths, I think, is a great all-encompassing term to describe all these different ways we can find value in the game.
Yep, value is everywhere. Just gotta know where to look for it. I think this might be a really good transition, though. You want to introduce our next topic here? Yeah,
so T2 unit compositions and how it differs from T1 and moving into the mid game. It's like, what are you looking to do? What are you looking to produce out of your bot lab or your vehicle plan, rather?
Yeah, and it's tricky. I mean, it's a blessing and a curse that there's so many units to pick from, and beyond all reason. We get our fair share of choices, but it also means that you have to make these choices, which can be difficult. That being said, there's definitely a lot of units that we see a lot more prominently than others. I think I've never seen a game where fiends don't come onto the field at some point. Welders are really common as well. We can see these here. Snipers, another really devastating one. Hounds are super frequent as well. Sheldon, all those really, really popular units that we see all the time out of the T2 labs. There was an idea that I brought up with you about the capabilities over counters. Do you want to give me your 2 cents on how you feel about that idea? And I'll explain it.
No, why don't you go ahead and fill us in on your thoughts?
Okay, I'll give you my thoughts on that. So, I was trying to find a surmised way, and I think I told you this, but I'd like to let you the viewer right there, you behind the screen know. This came to me at like 1:30 in the morning one night, and I wrote it down, jostled it down in my notebook, which is hilarious. But I had this idea of when we're looking at these units, there's not a direct counter to every unit. There's a lot of units that fill similar roles, but it's much easier to think about this game in terms of the capabilities of your unit composition instead of the exact unit composition of your unit, or well, your army. And I think a great example of that would be the sharpshooter versus the arbiter, which we can see here. The sharpshooter has this long charge up time before it fires a single devastating shot at whatever it aims at, whereas the arbiter launches these missiles periodically, much more frequently, but periodically, and these come down to devastating effect of whatever happens to be nearby. And so you can see that both of these have the capability of being a siege unit, but they're used in completely different ways. Whereas the sharpshooter needs to be spread out and it needs to be positioned in a certain way. The arbiter can take cover behind a mountain, and it can siege from a long distance out. In fact, I think it has a much wider range than the sharpshooters even. If we can actually take a look here, range of 1210 versus the sharpshooters range of 900. So I think that's a pretty good example of how units can fill different roles, or you can have different units that fill the same roles in an army, allowing for the same capabilities. And I think that's a good mindset to get into as far as what you should be thinking about when you want to build up your army. You want to play our game? How do you feel about that? We talked about it briefly.
Yeah, that'd be a fun.
Okay. Do you have the unit list up on Beyond All Reason?
Yeah. Let me pull it up.
You go ahead and pull it up, and I'll introduce the game. So I was thinking about a fun exercise that you and your friends can do if you if you want to memorize some of the units in Beyond All Reason. I was a freak, and I already went and memorized a whole bunch of them just on my off time for basically no reason. But what it can be helpful to do is to illustrate what the differences between the units are and how you might make the decision to counter these units one way or another. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to start by naming a unit, and BARCast is going to give me their response to the unit that they're going to produce in their army, their theoretical army, in order to counter the unit that I've brought out on the field. And the point of this is to highlight what units are viable for countering other units, and also the kind of mindset you want to get into for analyzing the battlefield and seeing exactly what you can do to counter the enemy's play here. You almost got that website up? We can jump right into this.
I'm looking at the Cortex unit list, so if you can name your Armada unit,
right.
I'll try and come up with the Cortex response.
All right, sounds good. So first unit I'll put out on the field is the Pawn.
Okay, so of course the Cortex counter to that unit, I suppose, would be the Grunt, or it fills the similar roles. Like the Grunt has superior range over the Pawn, so that would definitely be a little bit of a counter to it, I suppose.
I would agree. Yeah, that's definitely a good counter. I think I would choose the Mace, the light plasma or the medium plasma bot, in order to counter your Grunt. Has high health, high damage, very survivable.
Yeah, and if you see your opponent making these maces and want a heavier, tankier unit to kind of go toe-to-toe in these longer battles with heavier units, I would make the Cortex Thug. I suppose it has a comparable range to the mace and has the HP to kind of go toe-to-toe in these battles. You might not directly counter the unit, but definitely a response you can make in your unit.
Yep, I would agree. So if I saw my unit, or if I saw my opponent rather, making a bunch of thugs and I was making maces, I would probably think about a tech transition. I think it would try and get up into a Hound. I think that would probably be where I would aim to go.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's just a great thought process in general, really. It's like if you can't think of a T1 unit to counter what your opponent's doing, well, that's like, oh, I can get a tech advantage over my opponent and utilize these T2 units that typically like have a higher range, and you can start trading more efficiently. So
Yep.
the T2 Cortex response to the Hound would be the Shelton, of course. I mean, it's like these units share similar roles, have similar ranges, and would be a perfect T2. I'm not sure how well the Fiend does against Hounds. Perhaps you can share your thoughts on that unit interaction.
Sure. Yeah. I'm glad to share my thoughts on that. But first I want to say, yeah, I think we've definitely struck gold here with the idea that this is kind of the mindset you want to get into, right? If there's no other option for you, look at the tech transition as the way out of your T1, the way to solve your T1 issues. But yeah, I think the Fiend is probably a decent counter to the Hound because it can't jump on top of it. But I would definitely go with the Sheldon as far as filling the same capability in the role or in the army here, just because again, yeah, they have that long range sieging potential. But yeah, I think that's probably well enough for the purposes of this video, and you can practice that with your friends at home, your friends and beyond all reason. Go through that little mental exercise. You're gonna have a great time coming up with all sorts of fun little ways to simulate these games in your mind.
Yeah, especially if you're a newer player and still learning all these units. Say if your opponent calls out a unit you're not familiar with it. Well, I was just sitting there with the Beyond All Reason unit list on their website, and you can have access to all the different units. You can see the stats, and I'm sure there's some tooltips on that website that gives you a little bit of information about the unit and the role it provides. So
yeah, there's definitely some stuff. All right, so you want to jump on into our next topic here?
Yeah,
Keep
absolutely.
working through this.
And once again, this was kind of covered in our previous video. Would be, radars, T2 radar versus T1, how they differ, and how it becomes, I suppose, more important in the mid game.
Yeah, radar definitely has a slight change of pace in the mid game. The T1 radars are definitely very, very quote unquote spammable. You can just throw those down wherever you need them. The T2 radars are much more expensive, and so I feel like you have to use those a lot more strategically. You kind of want to put them in key positions. Don't really want to expose those to the front lines. They still die to a single hit from that nasty Juno, which we'll talk about here in a second. But the radars are just as important to have in that mid game for finding those opportunity paths, making sure that you can distinguish where your army is or where your enemy's army is posturing at. All that really important stuff for keeping yourself on your toes, dealing with the enemies.
Yeah.
Don't know if I have anything else about that.
Yeah, and I would just have to add that, as we move into the mid game and the T2 phase of the game, I suppose, is a lot of these units have a longer range than the sight vision they have as a unit themselves. So standing alone by themselves, a Shelton doesn't have the capability to shoot to its maximum range, whereas if you have a T2 radar in the back lines, or for that matter, you have a T2 radar bot with your unit composition, that's going to let you get the most value out of these units. In a vacuum.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a quick second to explain the nuances of radar coverage and how that works, because some people might be new to the game and might not know how that mechanic individually works. So just real quickly, for anybody who might not know, radar and line of sight are sort of two different types of vision. So when you have radar coverage, it gives you a little blip on the map, and I could probably show you that here if I just highlight something and show you the player view. You can see these little red dots. That indicates that there's radar vision in this area. And whenever that radar vision goes away, you can see those dots go away here. And the difference between radar vision and line of sight vision is if something is under a radar jammer field, then that little dot will not appear on the map. If something is if something is cloaked, it won't appear in line of sight, but it can still appear in a radar field. So for instance, those cloakable mines, the scuttles from the Cortex factory, those will still give off a radar signal, a radar presence, but the cloaking field will keep them out of line of sight. So hopefully that helps people distinguish between the capabilities of a cloaked unit. Sharpshooters are the same way. Sharpshooters can cloak, but they will still give off a radar presence when they fall under a radar field. They just can't be seen with line of sight.
So I suppose this is a perfect segue to our next topic, perhaps would be the Juno and how important it can be in the, for that matter, in the mid-game and late game, but how it specifically relates to the mid-game. Would you like to give your thoughts on the Juno and what its capabilities are and how players can utilize them in their games?
I would love to. So the Juno is a tricky one. You unlock the Juno as a T1 constructor. If I highlight a T1 construction bot here, we can see that under utility, you actually unlock this weird looking structure called the Juno. It's actually a missile launcher, although I argue that it does not look like one. But the point of the Juno is that it can immediately destroy anything radar related, and also it shuts down mines or anything like that as well. So what you use the Juno for is when the enemy has a front line and they have anti-radar features, they have radar jammers. You can drop a Juno on top of it and it will shut down the radar jammers. Also, you can drop it on top of their radars, and what that does is it means that any cloaked units you have will no longer be detected by their radar signature, and so your cloaked units are going to be able to traverse quite a lot smoother. Here you can actually see a few of these Juno out. There's also a few other niche capabilities of the Juno. One of the most useful is that it instantly kills any ticks that walk into its field. So you can see if I hit A, you can see this massive field here, and any tick that wanders into this field is going to explode immediately.
That's new to me. I actually didn't know that, so...
Yeah, well, there you go. For all those Cortex commanders who are super frustrated with the Armadas spamming ticks into their backline, that's the secret hard counter to the tick.
Yeah. I'm not sure if we mentioned it, but the Juno is a perfect counter to minefields as well. So if you know that your opponent has a mine layer out and has been laying minefields, along perhaps like run by paths, it's a good practice to suppose shoot your Juno missile into the minefield, clear out the mines, and then roll them with your army. So it's a great way to kind of protect yourself against these kind of more nuanced mechanics in the game.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a great way to just give yourself an extra layer of assurance that you're not going to lose your entire army to 200 metal worth of landmines that were laid out in the early game. Can prevent a lot of heartache. Let's see here. We've got some other ones, and I think we can get through them really quickly. This game's about to end, but I'd love to cover the rest of these here. Want to introduce our next one real quick?
Yeah, so it would be the Control D mechanic.
Yep.
And how that affects explosion size versus radius as units that just detonate on their own board.
So I can explain this really quickly and really concisely. The reason it's in the mid-game tips is because most of these units you're going to be producing, specifically the Scuttle, they're going to come out in the T2 stage of the game, and maybe in the late game. The reason you want to Control D them is to, well, that's self-destruct, by the way, is the control for that is Control D. The reason you want to self-destruct them is simply because their explosion radius increases dramatically. So when you self-destruct something, and you self-destruct a lot of things in this game, the explosion radius is way bigger than if you just let it die on its own, or in the case of the suicide bombers, if you just let them explode on their own. So get into the habit of making fewer scuttles and microing them better. Dedicate more APM to each individual scuttle, and that way when you detonate them, you're going to get the maximum value out of them, because they really can do quite a lot of damage. And so it's really important to get that maximum value you possibly can. But yeah, that's basically all I had to say about those. Just a helpful tip for if you didn't know that self-destructing can be super, super beneficial.
Yeah, and if I could relate this to 1v1, it would be a couple mechanics kind of come to mind. It'd be how you can control the LLTs and use the explosion radius to kill more units that are perhaps running by your front line than if the LLT were to be, kind of killing a few of them and end up getting destroyed. So it can be a decent mechanic. And then secondly, how if you want to deny your opponent a reclaim from your units, if say you're behind enemy lines and you don't expect to get any more value out of some of your units, you can Control D them, and that will deny the wreck and reclaim to your opponent. So.
Yep. Yeah, it's really important to do that, especially on those early T3 units. because they can leave several thousand metal out on the field, and or they could be resurrected, and both of which could swing the tides back into your enemy's favor. So definitely consider self-destructing, reducing that unit to nothingness. You're going to be in a great situation.
So that would lead to our final topic, I suppose?
Yeah, let's get into this real quick. Construction turrets.
Yeah, so construction turrets versus construction vehicles, and perhaps how this relates to the mid-game. I have my own thoughts on this, but would you like to go ahead and share what we mean by this?
Sure, yeah, I'll kick off the explanation for what we're talking about here. So the idea is when you're building build power, you have to decide between construction vehicles and construction turrets. And so it's important to know which ones you should produce and how many of each you should produce for your situation. Why don't you go ahead? Because I kind of want to hear what you say to jump off.
Yeah. So really, apart from being kind of contextual to like space and availability, it's like one is more flexible than the other, whereas construction turrets might be easier to spam, and you can diversify your build power, so to speak. I would say construction vehicles for newer players are a little more flexible, perhaps, and it's like, say if you have 20 construction vehicles in your main base assisting a factory, and you need build power somewhere on the map. Well, you just can't move a construction turret. So having construction vehicles over construction turrets kind of gives you the flexibility to put build power where you see fit on the map.
Yep. And you can allocate it however. You don't need to fuss over transports or anything like that. You can just queue them over, and you can suddenly build these frontline offensives that are really, really powerful. And I think that's super important. The last note I had about build power was just how to allocate it. And all I wanted to say was that in my humble experience, I find that typically when I'm in the mid game, about six constructor or construction turrets tends to do me well. I think you would need about double that in construction vehicles. You would need about 12, I think, or maybe 10. And the idea is to balance the amount of economy you're spending on upgrading, or balance the amount of your economy that you're spending on upgrading your economy with the amount that you're producing units. And I think typically for me a good balance is about if I have six turrets, that's going to be 2, 4, 6, 8, 12. No, that's how much build power is that going to be? This is going to be 1,200 build power. Usually about 400 of that I'll put into eco, and 800 of that I will put into building units. And I think that's usually a good balance for me. I'd love to hear what you think about 1v1s though.
I'll just have to say you broke the golden rule and tried to do math on stream, so...
I know, yeah, I oh my god, I knew I shouldn't have, but I tried and it fumbled.
Yeah.
Gets me every time.
Yeah, so construction turrets and maybe how they relate to 1v1s would just be, maybe just back to the flexibility aspect. If you see a reclaim field that kind of popped up on the map, you don't have res spots available to you because you've gone, vehicles. You have this mobile build power, which I think you alluded to the fact that you can actually pick up construction turrets with air transports and move them onto the map, but
it's tricky though. It's definitely more of a hassle than just clicking your units around.
Exactly, and I just say maybe as a newer player in the mid game, having the flexibility to put radars where you need them, get build power where you see fit, reclaim units as they arrive. It's better to, I would say, better as a newer player to kind of get comfortable using construction vehicles and bots over construction turrets. Not that you would completely steer away from one. It's just kind of my personal preference or understanding.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because when you're looking at ways to improve the dynamic reachability of your army, like ways to find value in different parts of the map, having an abundance of mobile build power is super, super useful, because what it means is that you can actually allocate it to places that matter, which is always great.
Yeah,
it can kind of feel wasteful. My last note on this is that I know I personally feel a little bit wasteful when I'm looking at building extra construction vehicles. Like, it bothers me when I see construction vehicles that are idle, And so I think not to build them. So I think even I could learn to become more comfortable with those.
Well, that kind of wraps up all the topics we had for y'all, and should finish the video for now.
Yeah, I agree. Hey guys, thanks a ton for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for the final part where we dive into the late game, and if you haven't already, go check out both parts to the early game tips on both channels linked down below. Thanks a ton, and we'll see you in the next one.